In our last video, we began work on our Project Street Sleeper clutch upgrade. We started by getting it up in the air, and then disassembling everything necessary to prepare for pulling the transmission out of its happy home. Everything went as planned, but we've got lots to do in order to finish the job. So let's get to work. Our next step in freeing up the transmission is removing the starter, supporting the transmission from below, and then removing the bell housing bolts. There are a couple sneaky ones on the engine block side, so be sure to reference your service manual to verify that you've gotten them all. Once the bolts are out, it's now time to slide the transmission out of the car. It takes a little wiggling and maneuvering to get it out of there, so be patient and make sure you have it supported well. An extra set of hands will make the job much easier. Here's a good look at the transmission out of the car. With the transmission set aside, we now have a great view of this newer clutch assembly, which the previous owner had installed at a shop years ago. What we're looking at here is your basic parts store replacement clutch setup. These are great at stock power levels and will typically last a long time, but when you start pouring on the power, they'll start slipping right away. So let's get it out of there. Next, we unbolt the pressure plate fasteners and remove it along with the clutch disc. Now we can see the flywheel, which looks to be in decent condition given how long this clutch has been in there. After removing the flywheel bolts, it simply slides right off. Now we can see the starter plate, which will need cleaned up a bit. While I was in there, I took the opportunity to address an issue that most everyone has or will face when modifying a front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive car: floppy engine mounts. So after supporting the engine from below, I unbolted and removed the front roll stopper mount. On a stock car, these big open areas in the mount support the engine while offering nice, quiet, vibration-free operation. But when you're hunting for more performance, all this slop can work against you and contribute to issues like wheel hop, lurching, and missed shifts. The downside is that the more you solidify these mounts, the more vibration and harshness that you transfer into the cabin. I don't want my steering wheel to feel like a paint shaker in my hand at every stoplight, so I'm starting by only beefing up this front roll stopper mount. If I need to firm up one of the other mounts, I can easily do that later. There are many ways to stiffen up a stock motor mount with varying degrees of harshness. While you can buy good products to solidify your mounts, I'm choosing a super low buck method, but one that I've had great success with in various cars I've owned. This method involves creating inserts to fill the voids of the mount. It keeps the mount design intact, and it's a little less harsh than some of the other products out there. Just start by heading on into your kitchen and grabbing a simple polyethylene cutting board. After measuring the openings of the mount, I used a jigsaw to cut out the rough shape that I needed. Then I grabbed a file, and after some test fitting, arrived at the final shape. I then hammered the inserts into their new home, using a little silicone spray to help out. Here's a before and after shot to show you the difference it makes. I then bolted our newly modified mount back in. Okay, let's take a look at our new clutch setup. I chose one that I've used in many of my 4G63 powered cars over the years, the good old ACT 2600 clutch kit. It's SFI approved and has a 415 foot-pound torque capacity, which is a 64% increase over the stock setup. It's ideal for street and race use, and while the stiff clutch pedal will definitely give you a scorching case of RCLS. The full-face sprung clutch disc delivers smooth, progressive engagement with little or no gear rattle. It's a great setup that includes a new throwout bearing, alignment tool, dowel pins for your transmission, and some high-temp lube. Here's a look at the ACT pressure plate and clutch next to the stock units. The most noticeable difference between the stock and ACT pressure plate are the diaphragm springs, with the ACTs being much beefier. This is where the additional clamping force comes from. The clutch discs look similar, but the ACT brings a host of improvements to the table, like a strong steel backing plate, more precise construction, and premium friction material, which offers more grip and heat tolerance. The ACT Streetlight flywheel is a big improvement over stock and is well suited for both street and drag racing. It offers an excellent fit, strong one-piece construction, lightweight, and is SFI approved. On this side, you can see some of the weight-reducing holes here in the center. On the back side, the weight reduction really shows, with the stalker having this thick inertia ring near the starter ring gear. There's also much less material overall back there. So how does all this weight reduction pay off? The stock flywheel weighs in at an even 20 pounds, while the Streetlight comes in at 12.5 pounds. Not bad. This is a good compromise weight, as a flywheel that's too light can be noisy and can cause drivability problems like bucking and tricky clutch engagement. Now let's compare the combined weight of the stock pressure plate, clutch disc, and flywheel compared with the ACT combo. The stock setup comes in at 32.5 pounds, while the ACT setup weighs in at 24 pounds. Saving 8 pounds of rotational mass while gaining more clamping force and durability sounds pretty good to me. To complement our new shiny clutch bits, I picked up an OEM clutch slave cylinder, fulcrum pivot ball, clutch release fork, return spring, and flywheel bolts. I also borrowed this Goodridge stainless clutch line from my old Talon, which further improves clutch feel and engagement. Alright, you guys know that I can't be bolting some filthy parts back in, so before we start reassembly, let's do a little cleaning. First up is the transfer case. They are supposed to be bright silver, not brown, so I used some mineral spirits and a brush to cut through this muck. Ooh, look, it's shiny under there. Next, I spent some time giving the transmission the same treatment. It was filthy too, and while I'm not going for perfection here, anything will be an improvement over this. Here's how it all turned out. Hard to believe this is the same part, honestly. The transmission looks great too. Now they're ready to go back in. Just a quick tidbit, there are two types of transfer case designs for old 4G63 powered cars. Both of these are for 1991 model year cars, but the one in the rear is for a first generation DSM. It's got a much beefier iron front case section, while the Galant is made entirely out of aluminum. The weight difference is significant, as the all-aluminum one weighs in at 30 pounds, compared to the other design, which weighs almost 5 pounds more. Also, I have no first-hand experience on this, but have heard multiple folks say over the years that the partial iron case version is stronger, which would make sense. Okay, let's get to installing our new clutch setup. First up is the flywheel. It's important that all the clutch parts are clean before bolting them in, so I wiped them down with a little brake cleaner to make them spotless. Speaking of clean stuff, here's a look at the cleaned up starter plate. After spreading on some Loctite high strength on the flywheel bolts, and with the torque wrench cranked up to 100, I tightened the bolts in a star pattern. Now it's time to bolt in the pressure plate and clutch disc. If this is your first clutch job, be sure to note the orientation of the clutch disc. I then put the disc in place using the alignment tool to guide and support it. Then I put the pressure plate in place. After adding some medium Loctite, I tightened the pressure plate bolts in a star pattern. It's important to go slow and gradually tighten the bolts, as this ensures that the pressure plate is torqued evenly. As you tighten, periodically check to make sure that your clutch disc is properly aligned. The tool should slide in and out freely, as seen here. Once the bolts are torqued to spec, the alignment tool can be removed, which means it's transmission time. You're probably wondering why I'm doing this job on my back. Well, call me old-fashioned, but I just like installing it with a floor jack this way. Old habits die hard, I guess. Take your time during this step, as you want to give your transmission's input shaft a nice straight shot onto the clutch disc splines. After plenty of wiggling and jiggling, the transmission mated up and slid on. Now it's time to torque the bell housing bolts to spec and reinstall all of the pieces and parts that we removed earlier. I mentioned this in the previous video, but keeping track of the fasteners that you remove in this way makes reinstallation so much easier. I then reinstalled and torqued down the transmission mount bolts inside the fender well and under the hood. My next task was to install the new clutch slave cylinder and stainless feed line. The install is very straightforward. It simply replaces this section of rubber line. Just unbolt the old line and install this new one in its place. The new slave cylinder bolts in place down near the bottom of the transmission. Next, I reinstalled the drive shaft and transfer case and torqued it all to spec. Before bolting this support gusset back in, I also gave it the same cleaning treatment as the transmission and transfer case. Man, you could eat off this thing. I'd like to eat off this thing. Hey, look at me eating off this thing. Next is the support brace and then the driver and passenger side axles. The passenger side uses this circlip, which requires giving the axle a little shove into the transmission to make sure it's seated. With all of that in place, it's time to put in some fresh fluid. So I grabbed the Redline MT90 and filled her up. I also topped off the transfer case with my big pump jug of Redline Shockproof. We're in the home stretch now. It's time to tighten the strut to spindle bolts and then torque down the 32mm axle castle nuts, which require a stout 180 foot-pounds of torque. After that, add a cotter pin and bolt your wheels on. Since I have a few other jobs to do in this area, I'll cover that along with bleeding the slave cylinder and adjusting the clutch later on. Then will come the most excruciating 200 to 300 miles of a car guy's life. Yep, I'm talking about the dreaded clutch break-in period. Thank you for watching. Thank you also for subscribing to my channel and visiting my Facebook page. Many of you have been sending me pictures of your cars and what you're working on, and that stuff always makes my day. So please keep it coming. I also want to thank ECM Tuning, Detective Coating, and Forced Performance for supporting Tom's Turbo Garage. Please check them out as they not only do great work, they're great people too. So with that said, thanks again folks, we'll see you next time.